There we go. Hello and welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me just fine. I'm very excited to launch this webinar today. Before I hand it over, I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Peter Transberg and I work for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, or INEE. For those of you who aren't familiar with our network, INEE is an open global network of members working across the humanitarian and development span to ensure that all individuals have access to quality, safe, relevant, and equitable education. Our work is founded on the fundamental right to education. While we've seen a lot of success, of course, over the last couple decades of this network's existence, we all know that there's still plenty of work to do to ensure that all learners have access to education in crisis contexts. We're very excited today to partner with Translators Without Borders, or TWB. On this webinar, we've actually been partnering with TWB for the past 2 years on translation services, which has really expanded our reach across our network to many languages. And we recently partnered with TWB on a survey about language in education and emergencies. And I'll let Alice in a couple minutes. But before I pass the microphone to Alice, who will be our host for today, I did want to run through just a really quick housekeeping note, and hopefully you can see the slide. Please do keep your mic muted throughout the webinar until it's time for the question and answers. That helps keep the background noise down. Any questions you have throughout the webinar, feel free to post them in the chat. We will make sure that the presenters see them at the end. There will also be a chance for you to speak up and actually voice your questions as well. But don't hesitate to type something into the chat all along the way. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording, as well as the presentation that will be presented, will be shared on the INE website and across all of our channels, and probably across TWB's channels as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over now to Alice, who will be our host for today's webinar. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful for Translators Without Borders. I'm going to get some slides up. Thank you, Kate, who's putting those up for me. So Translators Without Borders, we're an organisation which is a language specialist organisation, and we work both in humanitarian contexts and in development contexts, offering a whole range of language services. The language services that we offer are listed on the following slide, and what we're trying to do is to try and make sure that people begin to have access to support to enable them to build language sensitive communication strategies. So we work in a whole number of different ways. We work a lot on language data, trying to make sure that there's some good language data against which people can start planning their services and their interventions. So we try and map some of that so that people have a visual representation also about the different language communities in the area they're working. We've got work on language technology. Some of it's going to be presented today. We produce a whole lot of glossaries in lots of different underserved languages, particularly focused on education terminology. Obviously, we offer translation services. We've done a lot of research this year, and in fact this year has been really for us quite a big entry into the education field. We've had 2 big pieces of research launched this year. One is a cross-border study between Myanmar and Cox's Bazar, looking at the challenges in terms of access to service provision and how language has been a barrier to service provision, including in the education sector as well as other sectors. The second piece of research is going to be launched in the next couple of weeks, and that's specifically a very in-depth look at language barriers to education in Cox's Bazar. So those have been kind of 2 very interesting research areas for us, but we have been looking at language issues really across a number of country contexts, trying to understand how it affects people's access to service and in particular to education. The things that this has taught us, just to reflect a little bit.
Hello, Alice.
Before we go into some of the solutions, is
Alice,
to
if I may,
Peter.
So sorry about that. Yeah, the audio is a little bit choppy from your end, I think. I wonder if you pop your video off, maybe if that'll help with the bandwidth.
Happy to, yeah. Okay, thank you
Great.
for letting me know. Right, I'm hoping that
Cool.
gets for a better audio.
Seems
Okay,
so, yes.
talking about the barriers to education services. We've seen a real problem in how technical guidance is being understood and the sort of dense, complicated technical guidance which education staff are having to deal with in emergency settings. We're seeing where supervision and appraisals of teachers has been compromised by lack of language sensitivity, the same with teacher training, and also how language has been affecting our quality of needs assessments. So there's been some very interesting findings. As Peter mentioned earlier this year, we did the survey with INEE to look at how the INEE membership saw language barriers in education, and there were some really interesting results which we kind of fed back through the network. But one of the requests was for a discussion about solutions. So today's webinar is really very much focused on some of the language solutions which are out there, which could help all of us to tackle language better and to be more language sensitive. So we've got two speakers lined up for today. Kate Murphy, who is the program advisor on plain language with Translators Without Borders, who's going to be talking to us about some of the evidence behind plain language and what it means and how we can use it. And then Grace Tang, who is leading our Ghanaian language program, which is particularly looking at how machine translation can support marginalized languages. So I'm going to pass over, first of all, to Kate, who's going to lead us through the plain language section.
Thanks, Alice, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Plain language is a huge opportunity for the humanitarian and development sectors to communicate more effectively, not just with the people that we're trying to assist, but also with each other and other stakeholders that we deal with, government departments, for example. Yet, in my opinion, it's an opportunity that we're really not grasping. I see it as quite widely misunderstood, and I guess that leads to it being fairly undervalued, and that in turn leads to it being quite underused. And I think that's a shame, because it's a really powerful tool for doing our work more effectively. And one of the most powerful aspects of it is that it gives us a real ability to manage reader responses. And by that I don't mean that we're embarking on some sinister psychological manipulation, but really that by just simply being clear with people and removing ambiguity, cutting through the cloudiness and being as concise as possible, people naturally just do what it is that you intended them to do when you initially wrote the piece that they're reading. I can give you an example of that we've experienced ourselves. So as Alice alluded to, TWB uses thousands of volunteer translators to translate the content that we translate for our partners. And to do that translation for us, we require them to register on our online translation platform. They can't translate for us if they don't register. So when they first express interest to us in working with us, we send them an email. It's an email template, and we basically thank them for offering, and we ask them if they will please register on our translation platform. We were finding that that wasn't really happening, that there was a very low conversion rate from the people that were offering to help and the people that registered on the platform. I took a look at the email template that we were sending out in response to people expressing interest, and I thought that there were some things that we could do to improve the clarity of it. And I should say there was nothing inherently wrong with that email. It wasn't poor grammar. It was, gave us all the information that we needed, but with my editorial eye, at least, I thought that we could improve it. So we rewrote it. And in August, we started sending out the new version, and the response from readers was really quite remarkable. So in July, we had a response rate of 43%. 43% of people who opened our email actually went on to register on Cato. That's pretty typical monthly response rate for us. It was generally around 40, 50, 55%. After we sent out the revised version, it jumped to 78%. So for us, that was evidence, if we needed it, and we didn't, but it was further evidence that plain language is a really powerful way to get people to do what you intended them to do when you ask them to read your content in the first place. So how can we apply it more effectively in this sector? I said at the outset that I thought it was a misunderstood concept, and I want to talk about that a little bit, because the main misunderstanding that I constantly come across is that people assume that plain language is just about words. It's just about the vocabulary that we use. And while that's certainly true to some extent, it is very much a part of plain language, it's a minor part of it. And there are other elements of plain language that are really overlooked that really contribute to the power of using it as an effective communication tool. For me, there are three key aspects of plain language. The first is the substance of what you're saying. And it's really, this is a critical aspect of it, because this is the means by which we present a consistent message to the readers, and we minimize confusion, and we help them to focus on what it is that we want them to get out of this information. How can we do that? It's tricky, right? Because often we've got an enormous amount of information to share, and we've got lots of sub-messages, but unless we can articulate a single peak message, my view is that it's really hard to present it in plain language, and therefore it's really hard for readers to understand it as clearly and as readily as you might like them to. One tool that I find really useful in this that I'll share with you is to write a headline, and it sounds a little bit simplistic, and it maybe is, but often the simplest solutions are the best. If you can write the general gist of your piece in a single newspaper headline, that I think will really help you to focus the message and to help you to filter out and distill all of the noise that sometimes comes into our writing if we don't have a really clear focus. So give it a try. See, next time you go to write something, or when you're reviewing something, see if you can articulate a single 10 or 20 word top level message that will tell the reader what they need to know if they don't go any further with that content. It's not the only part of plain language, but it's a really important part of it. The second aspect is structure. And this is not just how we arrange the information, but plain language principles and research tells us that document design is also a really important part of plain language as well. So we need to get the information to align with our core message, and we need to present it in a way that really minimizes the effort that readers need to go to. I find that people often associate plain language with simplicity and with linguistic or educational challenges. But to me, it's much less about people's language ability or their cognitive ability. It's really about reading effort. So those of us that have English as a mother tongue can benefit from plain language just as much as somebody who's learned English as a second or third language. And that's because if it's applied correctly, it really reduces the effort that we need to go to. And in a sector like the humanitarian and development sectors, where we're often working under huge time pressure, huge resource pressures, and in quite often traumatic circumstances, we need to really get to the heart of the information as soon as we can. We don't need to reread sentences or look up unfamiliar words in dictionaries. So minimizing reading effort is what this is all about. And the third aspect that I want to share with you that I think is really important are the actual statements that we make. And none of these three aspects stand on their own. They all support each other in different ways. So the statements are the more technical aspects of plain language, if you like, the grammatical choices, the tense choices, the voice, the tones that you use, as well as the individual words. So as I said, they are part of it, but they're not the only part of it. I gave you an example of how you might, a tool that you could use to apply the idea of substance and a consistent message. Let me give you two quick tools that you might like to use to apply the structural aspects of plain language as well. The first one is to put your information in decreasing order of importance. So this is sometimes a bit counterintuitive because most of us learn to write by developing an argument. We start with background and context, and then we build to a conclusion of what we want people to know, and then we finish. I'm suggesting to you, as thousands of journalists before me have suggested using this model as well, that if you reverse that, you will be able to communicate far more effectively. And part of this is to do not only with how people read, but how they're reading on screen. So one of the big changes that we've experienced with on-screen reading is that we no longer are so clear about the entry and exit points from documents. People can come into your document from any number of points, and they might come in at different positions in the document. So it's critical to have that key message going all the way through it. It's also critical to make sure that wherever they come in, the most important points are never far away from them. So we'll talk in a minute about how we might make sure that that happens. But the inverted pyramid model, I find, is a really useful basis for organizing the material that you have, and a really useful way for screening out additional material that might not be so necessary and which adds to the complexity of a document unnecessarily. Another useful tool that I often apply is to arrange text in chunks, and there's various ways that we can divide text up so that we're not faced with an impenetrable wall. And really, if you think about it, it's not unusual to see text like this, even on screen in online documents. I often see just pages of text with nothing to break it up. And we know from reading studies and from cognitive psychology that this is really a wall to readers. They won't persevere with material like this. So there's a couple of things that you can do to break it up. You can use subheadings, bullet points, graphics are also a way to do it. Sorry, let me just go back one slide. And a quick word on subheadings as well, because this is something else that I think is a bit misused and misunderstood as far as plain language goes. I typically see people using label subheadings or topic subheadings that just really are a flag to the reader as to what's coming next, but don't give them any useful information. So bearing in mind what I said about people scanning and coming into documents from different points, just make sure that your subheadings really work for the reader and really give the reader important information, because we know that they hone in on the bold text subheadings. So make them work for you. Make sure they contain a really assertive statement that you can then go on to back up and give evidence for in the text that follows. But for those people that are just bouncing around a document looking for the information that they need, make sure that the subheadings are much more than something like introduction or curriculum or lesson plan. Make sure that they actually make a statement about what it is that you're about to tell the reader, and make sure that if the reader switches off at that point and doesn't read anything else, they've still got the gist of your message. And then in the last few minutes, I wanted to just share some ideas about the statements, the sentence structure and the words that we choose and how they fit into this whole plain language idea. If you want to have the biggest, the thing that arguably has the biggest impact on readability is sentence length. And this is one of the simplest things to change, but also one of the things that seems most prolific to me. And it's not unique to this sector, but we often just expect our readers to plow their way through quite long, convoluted sentences. And there's any number of studies that prove that the shorter the sentence, the higher the comprehension among readers. And we should use that data and make the most of it if we want to improve readability and reduce the reading effort. Here's one of those studies, this one from the American Press Institute. This was conducted a couple of years ago, but there's other studies that support it and are consistent with it. The y-axis shows the comprehension rates, the percentage comprehension, and the x-axis shows the number of words in a sentence. And we can see quite clearly here that up till about 18 words, comprehension levels are quite acceptable. We would hope that we've got about 75% comprehension of our material. But have a look at what happens when we go over that 18-word level. When we get to 30 words, reader comprehension on average is below 50%, which is not really something that any of us as writers would hope for. We would always want to be up higher in that, over 75% comprehension range. So what does that mean? For TWB, that means that we work on sentence length, an average sentence length of 20 words, and that's what we recommend all of our partners work on as well. Certainly no more than 25 words in a sentence, because the comprehension levels are just too low once you get to that level. So just get familiar with sentence length. Both MS Word and Google Docs allow you to measure sentence length, average sentence length or individual sentences. And you don't have to count the words in every one, but just get a sense of what a 20-word sentence looks like and make sure that that's what you're aiming for. And know that if you even go to 22 words in a sentence, it really does make a difference. And if you have 10 22-word sentences in a document, that impact is amplified. So sentence length is one of the most impactful aspects of plain language, and one of the things that you can change most readily and easily in your own writing. Lastly, I wanted to mention vocabulary. This causes lots of arguments and lots of headaches for me as an editor, and I think for writers as well, trying to figure out what is an appropriate word. And I'm often struck when I challenge writers on their use of particular words and I suggest simpler alternatives. Generally, I get pushback when I ask somebody to change a word, and the excuse is usually, oh, my audience will understand that. And as an editor, I don't really have a leg to stand on. If they tell me that, I have to believe them. This is one tool that does give me a leg to stand on. This is a screenshot from a website. It's a free website that lists the 5,000 most frequently used words in English. And I use this a lot to determine how familiar particular words are likely to be to an audience, and therefore what reading effort they might need to apply in order to understand them. You can see here that the most common word used in the English language is the, and the 56th most frequently used word is think. And you might say, well, we know what the simple words are. But actually, when you get up around 5,000, it's actually much more valuable. And so you can at least know when you've got a word that's likely to be harder for some people to understand. And so I should also explain the significance of 5,000 words. That's a useful cutoff for us, because we know that most non-English speakers have a working vocabulary of, it varies obviously with a whole lot of factors, but in general it's typically 5,000 to 10,000 words, working vocabulary. They might know a few more, but working vocabulary is around about 5,000 to 10,000 words. So if we make them only read words that are in the top 5,000 at the lower end of their likely vocabulary range, that improves readability. It decreases reader effort. So that's why we use this. You can find this on online. It's wordfrequency.info, and you can then just search through it if you've got questionable words or words that you're arguing about within your organization. This might just help sort out that argument for you. I find it to be a really useful tool. Before I finished, I wanted to just leave you with a little reminder of why all this matters. This is a map of the current multilingual emergencies that we're all operating in around the world. It gives you a sense of the linguistic complexity in the environment that we're operating in, and emphasizes, I hope, to you the importance of being really clear in what we say and giving everybody access to information in a language that they understand. It's critical for the effectiveness of our responses. Plain language is one way that we can improve that communication, and there are other ways as well. One of them that's emerging and is showing really exciting potential is language technology. And we have somebody here today with us that is an expert in that field and is well placed to explain to you how that's affecting what we do and how you can take advantage of language technology in your work. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, Kate. Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Tang, and I'm the Program Manager for Gamayun, TWB's Language Equality Initiative, which is an extension of our mission about communicating in languages that people understand, but taking it one step further and using language technology, advanced language technology, to be able to bridge the gap and even go one step further and enable people to communicate two ways. Let me just show you my screen. Yes, sorry, 1 second. Present. Sorry, everyone. So yes, many, if not most, of the 204 million people in need of assistance sit behind a wall, and their needs are invisible to us because of the language they speak. So they can't understand life-saving critical information, messages during an emergency, and they cannot be understood. So there's no flow of information between aid workers and the people that we're trying to help. So the wall is there because there's no technology, there's little resources for the languages people speak. So the local indigenous languages, what we also call marginalized or low resource languages. But technology can change all of this. In our sector, there have been huge leaps in the last few years in terms of connectivity. More people than ever in low and middle income have access to mobile phones and the internet. So there are apps to do data collection when doing needs assessments. There's tablets to do education. We're using social media more and more to get information and even monitor things and predict what's called predictive analytics. So language technology can really help, and TWB wants to use language technology specifically and put language forward. So machine translation, for example, is one of the most successful applications of natural language processing. So if we face a language barrier, for example, if I wanted to write something in French or somebody writes to me something in French, I just open up my web online and go to Google Translate, and I can just be able to get a very good on par to human translation equivalent. Sometimes the MTs, machine translations, are even surpassing human translation. But if you're speaking a marginalized language, if you are in Cox's Bazar, a Rohingya refugee, and you don't have access to these types of tools. And so what is the language technology? We're talking about being able to speak. If you're speaking Rohingya, being able to then capture that through speech recognition. Then you can use a machine translation tool, which translates the text into the target language, and then having speech synthesis. So it's in 3 steps currently to be able to get there. But the goal is one day that you can actually speak in one language and the other person will be able to understand exactly what you're saying without having to go through these steps. But to build language technology, you need huge amounts of data to be able to do that. So what we call parallel corpora. And that is essentially collections of sentences in both the source language, so if that's English, and the corresponding target language. So in this graph, what you see is the publicly available amount of language data sets. So French, for example, there are 3 billion sentences or language pairs. But if you look at the bottom with Rohingya or Kanuri, there is no language data available. And so that means that we can't build translation tools or language tools. And the reason for this is that for French, for example, here in Canada where I live, everything on government websites and there are laws in general about having information available in both languages, English and French. In the European Union, all the government documents, policies and whatnot are available in the major languages. But for languages in which we work, for example, there are no resources, there's nothing digitized, there's no information in this corpora to be able to build machine translation. So what we're doing at Translators Without Borders is building this data for these low resource languages or marginalized languages. So we're creating our own corpora with our community of translators. We have 28,000 volunteers around the world. We have program offices in Bangladesh and Nigeria and soon in Congo with the Ebola crisis. So we are proactively asking our translation community to help us build the data that we need. So that's text as well as audio, in which we can use as the basis to build machine translation models. Also, we're working with over 160 partner organizations like the Red Cross, like MSF, like all the major NGOs. The work that we do for them, we can also add to the model. So any translation we do for them in Kanuri or Rohingya, the idea is that we would in parallel use this data as well to help build language technology. So just to give you an example, we did a case study last year for the Humanitarian Action Challenge with the World Food Programme. They had a problem in which they were collecting feedback from users, so from refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan. They have a call center in which they're trying to get feedback on their programs. And they were asking one specific question, and they wanted to analyze over time what people's major concern was. So they were getting about 300 calls a day, and the people receiving the calls would transcribe this, and it would be in Levantine Arabic. But they didn't have a means to be able to sort through, process, translate all of that content, and then use it within their programming. So what we did was we developed a machine translation model for Levantine Arabic, and we worked with Mercy Corps to be able to gather colloquial Levantine Arabic off their Facebook page, in which they have a program called Cabrona, which is where people can get information when they arrive into Jordan on their rights, on how to register a birth. So we took all of their data and translated that and fed that into the machine translation. Also, they have this Facebook page in which people can communicate, ask questions, get feedback from moderators. So this was the type of spoken language that we wanted to be able to train our machine translation engine so that we could process that those comments. So in the end, what WFP could get is, as opposed to a spreadsheet of, thousands of comments from people, we could translate that automatically for them and also provide some keyword detection or give the frequency, a summary, like a dashboard at the end of the month. Okay, this month, 10% of people were talking about health issues, 50% were talking about prices, and then you can see trends over time on what concerns are so that they can integrate that back into their programming and respond better for beneficiaries. So the opportunities for language technology is really about opening two-way communication in which beneficiaries, affected populations can actually speak up and talk about what their needs are, and also allow aid agencies to better interact with communities. Also, as I mentioned, accountability, in which we can really integrate user feedback. And also with the machine translation, for languages where there is no machine translation, the time to take for a human translator to do the translation versus using an MT allows you to increase your speed and increase your capacity. So for example, with Levantine Arabic, we asked our translators to rate the output of our MT engine, and they were able to increase their speed by 38.7%. So that would mean saving 5 hours. You would still need a translator to post-edit, to review, to make sure that the content that came out of the machine translation is good and review it for quality, but at least the initial amount of work is done by a machine. So the idea for language technology is not to replace human interaction and translation, which is very important in circumstances such as rights, legal issues, medical care, but it's to be good enough so that you can really be able to just communicate at a simple level, to be able to have that two-way dialogue. So if you'd like to get involved, we're looking for partnerships for data. If you're working in some of the languages, our target languages, priority languages, if you're interested in having a use case that we can look at and work together, there's opportunities, and you can reach us at this page, and I'll leave it to that for Alice, maybe, if we've got some questions from the participants.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Grace and Kate. I think that's been really good. We've got one question come in, and I would encourage anybody now who has questions, please do either type them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and just fire away. I'm going to take us to the first question which has come in. So the first question that came in was from Manuel, who says, does Translators Without Borders offer any plain language services in the same way that it offers translation? Kate, maybe you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Thank you. Happy to take that one. Well, the answer is yes, we do. We work with our partners to negotiate as part of the scope of work that we do with each of them to include plain language services. And there are 4 key service areas that we are working in at the moment. The first is plain language assessment, where we will look at a document or documents and give you an idea of the likely readability and the areas that could be improved. We also offer some high-level editing, and it's quite limited, so it's focused on specific plain language elements that we think make the biggest impact to readability. The third one that we offer is training as a kind of capacity building initiative to help other partner organisations increase their own ability to use plain language rather than relying on us as editors. And the fourth one that we're just starting to work with now, and we've done with the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse principles, and also the core humanitarian standard core commitments, we've looked at vocabulary assessment in those documents. And so that's an area that we're expanding now as well. How can we identify tricky words in documents and suggest alternatives to make them more accessible to readers? So yeah, 4 key areas that we are able to offer to partner organisations.
Thank you very much. That's great. We've had another question in from Meron, who asks, what are your target languages? Meron, we're assuming that you mean for machine translation, but do speak up if that's not the case.
So yes, our priority languages is very dynamic in the sense that as the technology changes, we might need to shift our area of focus. But we have a number of criteria in which we really want to have the maximum value and impact. So where there are current crises, where we are also operating and know that there is a specific need based upon partners' requests and also what we see on the ground. So where we can have the greatest effect, and also where there is no current technology or data. So if we know that Microsoft is not going to do anything in Rohingya, obviously that's where we can have an impact. But if tomorrow they say, okay, we're going to develop something in Rohingya, we can't compete with Microsoft, and we don't want to compete with them. We want to be able to complement where the needs are greatest and where there is a big gap. So currently we're working in Rohingya for the refugee crisis, and that is particularly challenging and interesting because it's primarily an oral language where there's no standardized script, and so this is where audio and voice is going to be very important as opposed to text. And also in light of the literacy and preferred formats of the people we're trying to help, they prefer having audio. So Rohingya, we're also in northeastern Nigeria, and although most people speak Hausa, actually getting information in Hausa is not their preferred format. So local languages such as Kanuri, we'd like to develop machine translation for. We're also in the process of working on Tigrinya. That was from the European refugee crisis, where there still are needs in Europe for information in Tigrinya, as well as we continue to work on our Levantine Arabic model because of the continuing crisis in Syria, just to give you an example.
Fantastic, thank you, Grace. We've had another question coming in from Maria Pinzon, who says, where can we find data that you collect, and is it public? Shall I answer briefly about some of our language data, and then maybe Grace, you can talk about MT data. So we do a lot of work around data gathering on languages, and on our website you'll find that there's a whole section called language maps, and that's where you can find some of the background data about what, for example, these areas of Mozambique, these are the most well understood languages, or for example, responding to the Ebola crisis at the moment, here is here are some of the language data coming through from those areas of DRC. Northeast Nigeria, we've done a significant amount of work with the ION's DTM system, which has allowed us to be able to do camp by camp mapping, as well as working with Reach, who's done the household language data, and we're now able to do quite accurate spatial mapping of the languages. So those are all available, and they're on our website if you have a look, and our website is on the bottom. Data for language development in the sense of machine translation. Grace,
So yes, we're in the process of developing the corpora, and we would like to have that open source so that other people who are developing language tools can access that as well. So that will be available. We're still in the preliminary stages right now, so stay tuned for that.
Fantastic, thank you. Please do feel free to keep coming with questions. If you have a question, do just unmute yourself and feel free to ask it. While the questions are coming in, maybe I can just pose a question for Kate, which is, there is a challenge in general in being able to evidence work. Can we measure plain language? And if so, what kind of tools are available for that? Kate, you're muted.
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Alice. Well, it's not a straightforward answer to that question, unfortunately, but I'll try and make it as clear as possible. There are a lot of existing readability tests that people on this call, presumably within the education sector, may already be familiar with. They've been around for a couple of decades, and the output of those will give us an idea, for example, on what grade level a piece of content is likely to be able to be read by, how simple it is based on an assessment of the number of words with, say, more than 3 syllables, and also sentence length. I talked about the importance of sentence length in comprehension. Well, a lot of these readability assessment tools use sentence length as the basis of their one of their key criteria. Within TWB, though, we found that they weren't really giving us an idea of plain language, because there are so many more aspects of writing and of comprehension than merely syllables and sentence length. So we've added a number of criteria to our assessment techniques to try and build in some kind of an idea of how well a document is reflecting those broader principles, some of the ideas that I talked about earlier. And so that's part of the plain language assessment that I talked about. When we do those assessments for partners, we tabulate all of those different criteria. I think we're currently using about 20 different criteria. We tabulate those against benchmarks that we've set based on research and based on our own experience. And that report, that outcome of that assessment, is used to help a partner to understand what the key issues might be with readability. So the answer is yes, but TWB is working to try and improve the way that those readability tools can be applied to these more contemporary ideas of plain language.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We've had another question from Miron about whether we have regular webinars. Peter, I think I might throw some of this to you. I'll just answer from TWB's perspective. We don't hold regular language-focused webinars, but we would absolutely love to do some more. It doesn't necessarily have to be through this network. We're very happy to run webinars for about what are the language issues in your organization, and what kind of language, a little bit more kind of research into your particular area. Peter, would you like to speak a little bit more to INEE's more, copious amount of webinars and opportunities to engage?
Yeah, sure. In fact, yes, we hold a lot of webinars, more and more all the time, and we're really looking for feedback exactly like yours, Miran, to know what subjects, what topics, what speakers, organizations you're interested in. This will certainly not be the last collaboration with TWB. I think we've seen that there is a fair amount of interest in these projects and in the very practical tools that have been presented here. So I think we will do these again. Clearly, you can share the recording and presentation from this one as well with your colleagues. But definitely your feedback is critical, so we know what you're interested in. But yes, INEE does host a number of webinars, several each month, on a whole variety of topics related to education and emergencies. So we will make sure that if you're on our lists or on our social media feeds, that you're aware of them with as much lead time as possible. So yeah, do feel free to be in touch to let us know what topics, and if there's more specific language-specific topics you're interested in, we'd be happy to collaborate again with TWB to drill down into some other areas or specific languages or locations where they may have projects as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, great. We're getting questions in thick and fast, which is lovely. So a question I can see coming in from Anya, is do we have guidelines or research about writing for children and young people, especially in refugee communities? That's absolutely fascinating, Anya. We did a piece of collaboration, so I suppose there's two pieces of work we can talk to in that respect. We did a piece of research jointly in Greece with Save the Children, and that resulted in a piece of research particularly around communication with children and how they did something called translanguaging, which is a horrible piece of jargon, but how children were moving on a journey between one language and another and acquiring and using different terminology. So that was really interesting. We're now just about to do three more pieces of work specifically on children's language. One in Yemen, looking at terminology that children use to describe their bodies and things that happen to them in terms of sexual abuse. So that's going to be a really interesting piece of work around the appropriate terminology to use with children there. And another one related to the work on the Ebola crisis. So we've got some interesting work coming up, and we're hoping to start developing not only glossaries, but glossaries of euphemisms, which is going to be really challenging for us people who like to organize words into a nice and easy format. So that's going to be a really interesting piece of work. So thank you very much for that question.
Can I jump in and add to that, Alice?
Some of the other criteria.
Can I jump in and add to that question before you move on? Because the one on writing for young people, there is quite a bit generally available.
Please do go ahead, that would be great.
There is quite a bit of general guidance available, but from our perspective, what we would suggest there is to look at the things, readability criteria, like say the Flesch-Kincaid grade level assessments, which actually you can do quite easily on Word and Google Docs. And if you want to contact me separately, Anira, I'm happy to talk you through that and give that some context if that's something you're not familiar with already, and to give you some ideas of benchmarks on what you might like to aim for in that regard and how you can achieve them and manipulate the writing to better meet the grade levels that you're after.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So the plain language, Maria has asked whether we offer training of trainers on plain language and other language topics. Kate, do you want to speak to this one first, and I can come in on the other language topics bit? Yeah,
sure. The short answer is we haven't yet developed any trainer-trainer programs, but we have developed a couple of tailored plain language writing programs for different organizations. So I guess no, but we have the basis of that. I'd also be happy to provide some links to people if you want to contact me. There are a number of really useful resources on different websites, particularly US and UK government websites, that give really clear guidance on how to apply plain language principles. I'm not sure if that answers the question or if it just sounds evasive.
Okay. I can chip in a little bit around other trainers of training and trainers work that we do on other language topics. We are working a lot in the prevention of sexual abuse and exploitation and safeguarding, and in that respect we are trying to develop with some partners particular training and how language is important, and how they can begin a discourse in the various different country contexts, making sure that they really have a kind of good look at terminology and how they can build in with language focal point a language awareness component. So that's something that we're working with a number of us to continue to build on, and that has a training of trainers component to it. There's another question that's coming in, and I see that we're also coming towards the end of the conversation, so please throw in any more questions that I encourage you to get in any more questions that you like before we close. So a question from Fanman: are there examples of how language data can encourage educational improvement? I'm going to try and address this one from my perspective. There is, I think, language is something which the education sector obviously takes very seriously, but where language data a very serious missing component of a lot of the work. So while there's a lot of research around the importance and value of mother tongue in education, and 10% of children aren't able to access education in their mother tongue, what we don't have is the specific data which allows us to start doing language disaggregation, which is, I have to say, one of our kind of big pieces of advocacy. If we know that 20% of our community come from a particular linguistic minority, and we're not able to track their progress through education, then that's obviously a very significant lack of our ability to track a vulnerable group and their access to equitable education. So this is something that we're very, very keen to encourage, is language disaggregation. The more multilinguistic the environment, the more essential it seems to me to be. So where we have seen language data being used, we're really only at the beginning of seeing people starting to look at it and use it towards planning for language, for sort of multilinguistic components of the education in the classroom, it would be great to start seeing the kind of data disaggregation that could support further language intervention and help us understand really, you know, at what period in people's education their language access becomes absolutely critical, and where are we losing people. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I realized that my quality of sound is bad. Okay, thanks, Peter. I've turned off my video again. Okay, are there any other questions coming from the participants on the stage? Okay, we've got I'll give you a couple more minutes to think of any other questions that you want to, and maybe just while you're doing that, addressing a question to Grace, which is really just to ask how far away we are from a situation, from a language technology perspective, from where we can speak in what somebody can speak in one language and hear it in another.
Well, in the last, I'd say 2 years, language technology, the state of the art, has really progressed. But having said that, you know, Google has been working on this voice-to-voice in French, for example, which is the language that has the most data and that is probably the most advanced. And realistically, they say probably still 2-3 years away from being able to speak in one language and getting it out in French on the other end. So that just gives you an idea of where we are. But for Gamma Union, what we're trying to do for marginalized languages is very much more narrow in scope, in which we're looking at just everyday language, everyday speech, not just to have a good enough type of translation. Or we can do speech recognition, for example. We've developed in Bangladesh a glossary in which Rohingya is, you can hear the audio of a word, for example, such as diarrhea, and then you can get the equivalent in Bangla or English or Burmese. So if you have a more narrow focus and use case, you can create technology that is effective and useful.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay. I see that there are no further questions, and also that we're pretty much out of time. I'd like to say a very, very big thank you to INEE in terms of supporting us to be able to do this webinar. We're really delighted to be able to get the chance to talk about language, and would be, of course, very happy to engage with anybody who would like to follow up with us around their particular language needs, and of course to do further work with INEE on these kind of broader issues in the future. Peter, thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Alice, Kate, Grace. We really appreciate it, and like I said before, we don't think this will be the last collaboration on webinars for sure, if not some other trainings and so on. I would like to ask participants who are still on, if you would take 10 seconds to take a quick poll, just to tell us a little bit about your experience. Let us know if you liked it, if you didn't, and if you plan to share it. We just kind of want to know that, and we'll follow up in other ways to find out other topics that you might be interested in. But again, thank you to the presenters, to Alice, and to all the participants. I hope you all have a good evening or day wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye.